I learned to read a man's soul by the way he held his cards, and I learned to love a man I was never meant to touch. Both lessons came from the same house, the same silence, the same impossible distance between a servant's apron and a duke's signet ring. My name is Rowena Mercer, and for 7 years I walked the halls of Ashworth Manor with a dusting cloth in my hand and a secret burning quietly in my chest. The house stood on a hill in the county of Dorset, its stones the color of honey in summer and pearl in winter, its windows tall enough to catch the first light of morning and hold it like a breath. I knew every creak of its floorboards, every draft that slipped beneath the doors in January, every rose that climbed the eastern wall and bloomed in defiant pink against the gray English sky. I knew this house the way some women know their own children, with a fierce and tender knowledge that needs no explanation. I came to Ashworth Manor when I was 19, the year my father died and left me nothing but a worn deck of cards and a reputation I could not afford to carry. He had been a gambler, my father, not the reckless kind who loses everything in a single night, but the patient kind, the kind who watches and waits and reads the tremor in a man's hand when he holds a winning flush. He taught me everything he knew, not because he wanted me to follow his path, but because he believed that knowledge was the only inheritance a poor man could leave his daughter. "You will never sit at their tables, Rowena," he told me once, his voice rough with tobacco and regret. "But if you ever do, you will know how to win." I buried those lessons with him, or so I thought. I folded them away like old letters and tucked them into the darkest corner of my memory, where they gathered dust alongside my grief. When I arrived at Ashworth Manor with nothing but a small trunk and a letter of reference from the vicar's wife, I wanted only to disappear into the honest labor of service, to become invisible, to forget that I had ever been the daughter of a man who made his living reading the hearts of strangers across a green baize table. The Duke of Ashworth was 26 years old when I first saw him, and he carried his title like a wound that had never quite healed. His name was Cedric Ashworth, and he had inherited the estate 3 years earlier, after his father's sudden death from a fever that swept through the county like a whisper of doom. I remember the first morning I saw him, standing at the window of the library with his back to the room, his silhouette sharp against the pale light. He did not turn when I entered to lay the fire. He did not speak, but I felt his presence the way one feels a change in the weather, a shift in the air that makes the skin prickle with awareness. He was not handsome in the way the poets describe, not soft or romantic or given to tender glances. His face was all angles, cheekbones like the prow of a ship, a jaw that seemed carved for stubbornness, eyes the color of winter storms. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was a brief thing, a flash of unexpected warmth that vanished before one could be certain it had existed at all. The servants whispered that he had been different before his father died, lighter somehow, quicker to laugh. But I never knew that man. I knew only the Duke who walked the halls of his own house like a ghost, who spent his evenings alone in the library with a glass of brandy and a book he never seemed to finish, who looked at the portraits of his ancestors as though he were apologizing for something none of us could name. I should not have noticed him at all. A maid does not notice her master, not in that way, not with that particular ache that settles behind the ribs and refuses to be dislodged. But I did. I noticed the way he stood a little straighter when Lady Sophronia entered a room, as though her presence reminded him of who he was supposed to be. I noticed the way he paused sometimes at the window of the morning room, watching the rain fall on the gardens with an expression that was not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it, something that made me want to cross the impossible distance between us and lay my hand upon his arm. I noticed, and I despised myself for noticing, because noticing was the first step toward hoping, and hoping was a luxury I could not afford. Lady Sophronia Ashworth was the Duke's great-aunt, a woman of 73 years who had outlived 2 husbands, 1 scandal, and the entire generation that might have remembered her youthful indiscretions. She was small and sharp, with silver hair pinned in an elaborate arrangement that seemed to defy both gravity and fashion, and eyes that missed nothing. She had come to live at Ashworth Manor after the old Duke's death, to help her great-nephew manage the household, she said, though I suspected her true purpose was simply to watch. Lady Sophronia was a great believer in watching. She sat in her chair by the fire in the drawing room, her embroidery in her lap, and she watched the way a hawk watches the field below, patient and precise and utterly without mercy. She watched me too. I felt her gaze upon me sometimes when I was clearing the tea things or adjusting the curtains, and I knew that she saw more than I wanted her to see. But she never spoke of it. She only watched and waited, and smiled her small, knowing smile. The other person who saw me, truly saw me, was Phoebe Wren, the cook. Phoebe was a stout woman of 50, with flour perpetually dusted on her apron, and a laugh that could fill the entire kitchen like warm bread rising. She had been at Ashworth Manor for 30 years, had known the Duke when he was a boy who stole biscuits from her cooling racks, and she loved this house and everyone in it with a ferocity that bordered on the maternal. She was the first person to speak kindly to me when I arrived, the first to notice when I had not eaten, the first to sit beside me in the servants' hall on the anniversary of my father's death, and say nothing at all, only press her warm hand over mine and let the silence do its work. It was Phoebe who told me about the card games. I did not know at first that the Duke played. He was so private, so contained, that I imagined his evenings consisted of nothing more than books and brandy and the slow contemplation of his own solitude. But Phoebe had been in this house long enough to know its secrets, and one evening, as we sat together in the kitchen after the household had retired, she told me what she had seen. "He plays with gentlemen from London," she said, her voice low, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Once a month, sometimes more. They come in their fine carriages and sit in the card room until dawn, and sometimes the Duke wins, and sometimes he loses. But lately, Rowena, lately he loses more than he wins." I felt a cold finger trace down my spine. "Why does he play?" I asked. "If he loses?" Phoebe shook her head, her eyes sad. "Because his father played," she said. "Because this house costs more to keep than it earns. Because the old Duke left debts that the young Duke has been trying to pay for years, and the cards are the only way he knows to pay them faster." She paused, and her voice dropped even lower. "And because there is a man who keeps inviting him to play. A man who wants this house more than he wants anything else in the world." The name she spoke next was Lionel Craven, Baron of Thornfield, and even in the warmth of the kitchen, I felt the chill of it. I had seen Baron Craven only once, on a morning when he came to call on the Duke, and I happened to be polishing the banister in the entrance hall. He was perhaps 40 years old, tall and lean, with hair the color of wet slate and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He moved through the house as though he were already measuring the rooms for new furniture, already calculating the value of the paintings on the walls, already imagining his own name carved above the door. The Duke received him with cold civility, and I watched from my place on the stairs as they disappeared into the study, and I knew with a certainty I could not explain that this man was dangerous. "He wants Ashworth Manor," Phoebe said. "He has wanted it for years. His own estate is grand enough, but it is not this. It is not the house that has stood for 300 years, that has hosted kings and poets and the finest families in England. He is a man who collects beautiful things, Rowena, and this house is the most beautiful thing in the county." I thought of the Duke standing alone at the library window, watching the rain. I thought of the weight he carried, the debts he had inherited, the pride that would not allow him to sell a single painting or dismiss a single servant. I thought of the way he looked at this house, not with the possessive gaze of an owner, but with the desperate tenderness of a man trying to hold water in his hands. And I thought of my father, and the cards, and the lessons I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten they existed. The night it happened was in late October, when the leaves had turned to copper and gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and the coming winter. I was in the upstairs corridor, changing the candles in the sconces, when I heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock, and I moved to the window to see who might be arriving at such an hour. There were 3 carriages, black as beetles in the moonlight, and from them emerged a company of gentlemen in dark coats and tall hats. I recognized Baron Craven at once, his silver-headed walking stick catching the light as he strode toward the door. The others I did not know, but I knew what they had come for. I knew it in my bones, the way my father had taught me to know things, by instinct and observation and the cold certainty of experience. I should have returned to my duties. I should have finished the candles and gone downstairs to help Phoebe prepare the refreshments that would be required for such an evening. But something held me at that window, watching as the gentleman disappeared into the house below, and something whispered in my ear that this night would be different from all the others, that something was about to change. I do not know how long I stood there, but when I finally turned away, Lady Sophronia was watching me from the shadows of the corridor. "You know what is happening tonight," she said. It was not a question. "I know that gentlemen have come to play cards," I said carefully. She studied me for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeing everything I tried to hide. "You are not like the other maids," she said. "You watch too closely. You think too much." She paused, and something flickered in her expression, something that might have been recognition. "Your father was Marcus Mercer, was he not? The gambler who won the Pennington emeralds in a single hand and gave them back because he said the lady's tears were not worth the price of the stones?" My throat tightened. "You knew my father?" "I knew of him," she said. "Everyone in a certain world knew of Marcus Mercer." She tilted her head, considering me. "He taught you, did he not? To play? To read? To win?" I could not lie to those eyes. "Yes," I whispered. Lady Sophronia nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something she had long suspected. "Go to your room, Rowena," she said. "Sleep if you can, but keep your ears open and your wits about you. I fear this night will not end well." She was right. I did not sleep. I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to the distant murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter that drifted up from the card-room below. The hours passed slowly, marked by the chiming of the great clock in the entrance hall, and with each passing hour, the laughter grew quieter, the silences grew longer, and the weight of dread in my chest grew heavier. It was nearly 4 in the morning when I heard the scream. Not a scream of terror, but something worse, a cry of anguish so raw and broken that it seemed to split the very air. I was out of bed before I knew what I was doing, pulling my shawl around my shoulders, running down the servants' staircase toward the sound. The card-room was in chaos. Chairs had been overturned, glasses shattered on the floor, and in the center of it all stood the Duke, his face white as bone, his hands trembling at his sides. Baron Craven sat at the table, a slow smile spreading across his face, and in his hands he held a piece of paper, a document covered in writing, a document I knew at once was the deed to Ashworth Manor. The Duke had lost everything. And as I stood in the doorway, invisible in my servant's grey, I felt something awaken inside me, something I had buried for 7 years, something that had been waiting for this exact moment. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "You will never sit at their tables, Rowena, but if you ever do, you will know how to win." I looked at Baron Craven's triumphant smile. I looked at the deed in his hands. I looked at the Duke, broken and defeated, the house he loved slipping through his fingers like sand. And I knew what I had to do. The silence that followed the Duke's cry was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It pressed against my ears like water, thick and suffocating, and in that silence I could hear every heartbeat in the room, including my own, which hammered against my ribs as though trying to escape. Baron Craven was the first to speak. He folded the deed with deliberate care, his long fingers smoothing the creases as though he were handling something infinitely precious. "The house is mine now, Ashworth," he said, and his voice was soft, almost gentle, the voice of a man who has waited years for this moment and intends to savor every second of it. "I trust you will have your belongings removed by the end of the week. I am a generous man, after all. I will give you 7 days." The Duke did not move. He stood frozen in the center of the room, his hands still trembling at his sides, his face a mask of such profound despair that I felt my heart crack along a fault line I had not known existed. I had seen grief before, had felt it myself when I held my father's hand as he slipped away. But this was something different. This was the death of a legacy, the destruction of everything he had fought to preserve, and I watched it break him the way a storm breaks a ship against the rocks. The other gentlemen shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They were not cruel men, I thought, merely weak ones. Men who had come to play cards and drink brandy and had found themselves witnesses to a catastrophe they did not know how to address. One of them, a stout fellow with ginger whiskers, cleared his throat and muttered something about the lateness of the hour. Another reached for his coat, eager to escape the wreckage of the evening, but Baron Craven was not finished. He rose from his chair, the deed tucked safely in his breast pocket, and walked toward the Duke with the slow, measured steps of a predator approaching wounded prey. "You should have accepted my offer last year, Ashworth," he said. "I would have given you a fair price. But you were too proud, were you not? Too attached to these old stones and dusty portraits." He paused, standing close enough now that I could see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. "Pride is a luxury only the wealthy can afford. And you, my friend, are no longer wealthy." Something snapped inside me. I do not know how else to describe it. It was as though all the years of silence, all the invisible hours of watching and waiting and wanting had gathered into a single point of light inside my chest, and that light had suddenly caught fire. I stepped forward out of the shadows of the doorway into the pool of candlelight that illuminated the wreckage of the card table. Every head in the room turned toward me. I imagine I made quite a picture, standing there in my plain gray dress with my shawl clutched around my shoulders, my hair loose from its pins and tumbling over my shoulders in a manner that no proper servant would ever allow. I was aware of the impropriety of it, aware of the shocked expressions on the gentlemen's faces, aware most of all of the Duke's eyes upon me, wide with confusion and something else I could not name. But I did not care. I had spent 7 years being invisible, and now, for the first time in my life, I wanted to be seen. "I beg your pardon," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, clear and calm in the heavy silence. "I could not help but overhear the conclusion of your game." Baron Craven's eyebrows rose. He looked at me the way one might look at a mouse that had wandered into a ballroom, with amusement and faint disgust. "And who," he asked slowly, "are you?" "My name is Rowena Mercer," I said. "I am a maid in this household." "A maid?" The Baron's smile widened, sharp as a blade. "How delightful! And does it amuse you, Miss Mercer, to eavesdrop on your betters? Does it entertain you to witness the downfall of your master?" The Duke stirred, as though waking from a dream. "Rowena," he said, and my name in his mouth was like a bell struck in an empty church, resonant and strange. "You should not be here. Go back to your quarters." But I did not move. I could not. The fire inside me had burned away my fear, my caution, everything that had kept me silent for so long. I looked at Baron Craven, at his triumphant smile and his cold eyes, and I felt something that might have been hatred, but was closer to clarity. "I have a proposition," I said. The Baron laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound, like breaking glass. "A proposition? From a maid?" He shook his head, still chuckling. "My dear girl, do you have any idea what you are saying? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," I said. "You are a man who has wanted this house for years. You are a man who has played against the Duke month after month, waiting for the night when his luck would finally turn. You are a man who collects beautiful things, not because you love them, but because you love the power of owning what others cannot have." The laughter died in the Baron's throat. He studied me now with new eyes, wary and calculating, and I saw the moment he realized I was not simply a servant who had wandered into the wrong room. "You are also," I continued, "a man who cannot resist a wager." The room had grown very still. The other gentlemen sat frozen in their chairs, their earlier eagerness to leave forgotten. The Duke stood motionless, his eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. And Baron Craven, for the first time that evening, looked uncertain. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I am suggesting one more game," I said. "One hand, you and I. If you win, you keep the deed, and I will enter your service for the remainder of my days, bound to whatever duties you see fit to assign me. But if I win, you return the deed to the Duke of Ashworth, and you never set foot in this house again." The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the candles guttering in their holders. Then, slowly, Baron Craven began to laugh again, but this time there was something different in the sound, something that might have been genuine amusement. "You cannot be serious," he said. "A maid challenging me to cards? With what stake? Your apron and dusting cloth?" I reached into the pocket of my dress and withdrew a single coin. It was small and worn, the face of the sovereign nearly rubbed smooth by years of handling, but it gleamed in the candlelight like a tiny sun. "This," I said, £1 sterling. It is everything I have in the world." The Baron stared at the coin, then at me, then at the coin again. His expression shifted through several emotions, surprise, contempt, curiosity, and finally settled on something that looked almost like respect. £1, he repeated, "against the deed to Ashworth Manor. You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Mercer. Perhaps both," I said, "but I am also very good at cards." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the gentlemen, the stout fellow with ginger whiskers, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with interest. "I say." "Craven," he said, "you cannot possibly take her seriously. It would be beneath your dignity." "On the contrary," said another gentleman, a thin man with a monocle and an air of perpetual boredom. "I find myself rather intrigued. The Baron has won everything tonight. What harm could there be in one more game?" Baron Craven was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on mine. I could see him weighing his options, calculating the odds, measuring the risk against the reward. He was a gambler after all, and gamblers cannot resist a challenge, especially one that seems so absurdly one-sided. "Very well," he said at last. "One hand, 5-card draw. The lady may name the stakes she has already proposed." He paused, and his smile returned, colder now, sharper. "But if she loses, she comes to Thornfield Hall as my servant, permanently. She will scrub my floors and empty my chamber pots until the day she dies." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I did not waver. I inclined my head in acceptance. "Agreed." "No." The Duke's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Rowena, I forbid it. I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself for my sake." He stepped toward me, his face twisted with anguish. "This is madness. You cannot possibly win against him. He is one of the most skilled card players in England." I turned to face him, and for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to look at him the way I had never dared to look before. I let him see everything I had hidden for 7 years, the devotion, the longing, the desperate, fierce love that had grown in my heart like a rose in winter, blooming against all odds. "Your Grace," I said softly, "I know what I am doing. Trust me." Something passed between us in that instant, something wordless and profound. I saw his expression shift, the despair giving way to wonder, the wonder giving way to something that looked almost like hope. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. Then Lady Sophronia's voice cut through the silence like the crack of a whip. "Let her play. We all turned to see her standing in the doorway, resplendent in a dressing gown of midnight blue, her silver hair loose around her shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight. She looked like a queen, ancient and imperious, and even Baron Craven seemed to shrink slightly under her gaze. "Lady Sophronia," he said, inclining his head in a gesture of respect that was not entirely feigned. "I did not realize you were still awake." "I am always awake when wolves are circling my family," she said coolly. She walked into the room with the unhurried grace of a woman who has never in her life been intimidated by anyone, and she took a seat in the chair nearest the fire. She rested her hands on the arms of the chair and fixed Baron Craven with a stare that could have frozen the Thames. "Let the girl play her hand, unless you are afraid." The Baron's jaw tightened. "I am afraid of nothing. Then prove it." Lady Sophronia smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that reminded me of a cat contemplating a particularly foolish mouse. "One hand, Baron. Surely a man of your considerable skill cannot be worried about a simple maid with a single pound to her name." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If the Baron refused now, he would look like a coward, and whatever else he might be, he was too proud to bear that humiliation. I saw the moment he realized this, saw the flicker of anger in his eyes before it was smoothed away by the mask of cold composure. "Very well," he said again. He returned to his seat at the card table and gestured to the chair across from him. "Miss Mercer, if you please." I walked to the table on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The other gentlemen had arranged themselves around the edges of the room, eager spectators to this most unusual contest. The Duke stood apart, his hands clenched at his sides, his face a study in barely controlled emotion. And Lady Sophronia watched from her chair by the fire, her eyes gleaming with something that might have been pride. I sat down across from Baron Craven and placed my single pound on the table between us. He looked at it with contempt, then reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the deed to Ashworth Manor. He laid it beside my coin, and the contrast between them was almost absurd, a worn copper disc beside a document worth thousands of pounds. "Shall I deal?" the Baron asked, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "No." I met his eyes without flinching. "I will deal." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or wariness, but he inclined his head in acquiescence and pushed the deck of cards across the table toward me. I picked up the deck and felt its weight in my hands. The cards were smooth and well-worn, the edges soft from years of handling. They felt familiar, comforting, like the embrace of an old friend. I had not held a deck in 7 years, but my hands remembered, my fingers remembered. The lessons my father had taught me, night after night in our cramped little room above the tavern, came flooding back like a river breaking through a dam. I shuffled the cards with a fluidity that made the Baron's eyes narrow. Once, twice, 3 times, the cards whispering against each other like secrets being exchanged. Then I set the deck on the table and began to deal. 5 cards each, face down. The candlelight flickered across the green baize, casting strange shadows that danced like spirits. I could feel every eye in the room upon me, could hear every breath, every heartbeat. The world had narrowed to this table, these cards, this moment. I picked up my hand and looked at it, and in that instant, I knew that fate had not abandoned me after all. The cards in my hand were not extraordinary. A pair of 7s, a jack, a 4, and a 9 of hearts. It was the kind of hand that most players would consider mediocre, the kind that invites hesitation and doubt. But my father had taught me long ago that cards are only half the game. The other half is the player sitting across from you, the tremor in his fingers, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his eyes move when he thinks no one is watching. I studied Baron Craven over the edge of my cards. He held his hand close to his chest, his face a mask of perfect composure. But I had been watching men like him my entire life. I saw the slight tension in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He had a good hand, perhaps even an excellent one, but he was not certain of it. There was doubt lurking beneath his confidence, and doubt is a gambler's greatest enemy. "How many cards would you like to exchange, Miss Mercer?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. I considered my options. The safe play would be to keep the pair of sevens and discard the rest, hoping to improve my hand with 3 new cards. But safe plays are for players who have something to lose, and I had already wagered everything I had. My single pound sat on the table like a promise, and beside it lay the deed that represented not just a house, but a man's legacy, his honor, his very identity. "I will take 2, I said. I discarded the 4 and the 9, keeping my pair of sevens, the jack, and the heart that might, if fortune favored me, become part of something greater. The Baron dealt me 2 new cards from the deck, and I picked them up without allowing my expression to change. A 7 of clubs, and the Queen of Hearts, 3 sevens. It was not an unbeatable hand, but it was strong, stronger than the Baron would expect from a servant girl with a single pound to her name. I arranged the cards in my hand and waited. The Baron studied his own cards for a long moment, then looked up at me with that cold, calculating smile. "I will take 1, he said. 1 card. That meant he already had something significant, a pair at least. Possibly better. He was hoping to complete a straight or a flush, or perhaps to add to an already formidable combination. I watched him draw the single card and slide it into his hand, watched the minute relaxation of his shoulders that told me his gamble had paid off. "Shall we reveal?" he asked. I nodded. He laid his cards on the table with a flourish. "A full house," he announced. 3 queens and a pair of 4s. He smiled, a predator's smile, all teeth and triumph. "I believe that is rather difficult to beat, Miss Mercer." The room held its breath. I could feel the weight of every gaze upon me, the despair radiating from the Duke, the sharp attention of Lady Sophronia, the morbid curiosity of the assembled gentlemen. This was the moment. This was everything. I laid my cards on the table, 1 by 1. 7 of diamonds, 7 of spades, 7 of clubs, Jack of spades, Queen of hearts. 3 of a kind, I said quietly. 3 sevens. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Baron Craven's smile widened and a harsh laugh escaped his throat. 3 sevens against a full house. "My dear girl, you have lost. Did you truly not know the rankings? A full house beats 3 of a kind." He reached for the deed, his fingers already closing around the paper. "I almost feel sorry for you." But I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply looked at him with the calm certainty that my father had taught me to wear like armor. "You did not let me finish," I said. His hand froze. "What?" I reached down and turned over the 2 cards I had kept face down on the table, the Jack and the Queen I had been holding all along. 3 sevens, I repeated, and a Jack and Queen of hearts to accompany the 7 of hearts, the 8 of hearts, and the 9 of hearts that were already in the deck's discard pile from your earlier exchanges tonight. I paused, letting the words sink in. "But more importantly, Baron Craven, your 3 queens are impressive. However, I could not help but notice that you drew your 3rd queen just now, on your single card exchange." The Baron's face had gone very still. So I happened to observe, earlier this evening, when I was standing in the doorway, that the Queen of Diamonds was already played and discarded in the previous hand between yourself and His Grace. I gestured to the small pile of discards that sat at the edge of the table, remnants of the Duke's devastating loss. "That queen should not have been available for you to draw." A murmur rippled through the room. The gentleman with the monocle leaned forward, his boredom replaced by sharp interest. The stout fellow with ginger whiskers had gone pale. Baron Craven's composure cracked. "That is a serious accusation," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are calling me a cheat." "I am observing a discrepancy," I said calmly. "The Queen of Diamonds was played and discarded. It should be in that pile. If it is not, then it found its way back into the deck by some means other than chance. I looked at him steadily. "Shall we examine the discards, Baron?" The silence that followed was absolute. I could see the calculation in the Baron's eyes, the rapid weighing of options. He could demand an examination and risk exposure if my accusation was correct. He could refuse and look guilty. Or he could fold, accept his loss, and retreat with whatever dignity he had left. Lady Sophronia's voice cut through the tension like a silver knife. "I believe," she said, "that an examination would be in everyone's best interest." She rose from her chair and walked to the table, her dressing gown trailing behind her like a royal robe. Unless, of course, the Baron would prefer to concede the matter. Baron Craven's face had gone from pale to flushed. The mask of composure had shattered entirely now, and beneath it I saw something ugly, something desperate. He looked around the room at the assembled witnesses, at the gentlemen who had been his allies mere moments ago, and he saw what I saw. He saw suspicion. He saw doubt. He saw his reputation crumbling like ancient mortar. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You cannot seriously believe the word of a servant over mine." "I believe," said the gentleman with the monocle, "in the evidence." He stood and walked to the discard pile, rifling through the cards with careful fingers. After a moment he looked up. "The Queen of Diamonds is not here." The room erupted. Voices rose in accusation and denial. Chairs scraped against the floor, and somewhere in the chaos I heard the Baron shouting that this was a conspiracy, a trick, a plot orchestrated by the Ashworth family to cheat him of his rightful prize. But it was too late. The other gentlemen had seen enough. They were backing away from him now, their faces twisted with disgust and contempt. In their world, there was no greater sin than cheating at cards. A man might be a drunkard, a spendthrift, even a coward, and still maintain his place in society. But a cheat was beyond redemption. A cheat was finished. Baron Craven turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You," he snarled. "You planned this. You knew all along." "I knew what I saw," I said quietly. "I knew that a man who wants something badly enough will sometimes bend the rules to get it. And I knew that the only way to defeat such a man is to watch him more closely than he watches himself." He stared at me for a long moment, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. I thought for an instant that he might strike me, might cross that final line and damn himself completely. But even in his rage, some vestige of self-preservation held him back. "This is not over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have made an enemy tonight, Miss Mercer. You and your precious Duke will regret this." He turned on his heel and strode from the room, his coattails flying behind him like the wings of a defeated crow. A moment later, I heard the front door slam, and then the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, retreating into the night. The room was very quiet. I stood alone at the card table, my hands trembling now that the crisis had passed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The deed to Ashworth Manor lay on the green baize where the Baron had dropped it in his fury, and I stared at it as though it were a living thing, a creature that had been rescued from the jaws of a predator. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, gentle and warm. I turned to find the Duke standing beside me, his face transformed by an emotion I had never seen there before. The despair was gone, replaced by wonder, by gratitude, by something deeper and more profound that I dared not name. "Rowena," he said, and his voice was hoarse, as though he had been holding back tears. "How did you do that?" "I watched," I said simply. "I remembered. I did what my father taught me to do." He shook his head slowly, as though he could not quite believe what had happened. "You risked everything. Your freedom, your future, for this house, for me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I should have looked away, should have remembered my place, should have retreated into the safety of servants' deference. But I was tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of being invisible. "This house is my home," I said quietly. "It has been my home for 7 years. I could not let it fall into the hands of a man who would never love it as it deserves to be loved." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. Then he reached down and picked up the deed from the table. He held it for a moment, looking at it as though seeing it for the first time, and then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He held it out to me. "Take it," he said. I stared at him, uncomprehending. "Your Grace?" "Take it," he repeated. "You won it. It belongs to you now." I shook my head, stepping back as though the deed were a live coal that might burn me. "No, I cannot. I did not play for myself. I played for you, for this house, for everyone who lives within these walls. And I am giving it to you," he said, his voice steady. "Not as payment, not as reward, but as a gift, because you saw what no one else saw, because you risked what no one else would risk, because you saved not just my home, but my honor." Tears pricked at my eyes. I could not accept such a gift. It was impossible, unthinkable. A maid could not own a manor. A servant could not become a lady. The world did not work that way, and pretending otherwise would only lead to heartbreak. But before I could voice my refusal, Lady Sophronia stepped forward. She laid her hand on the Duke's arm, a gesture that was both gentle and firm. "Cedric," she said quietly, "there will be time for such discussions later. For now, let us simply acknowledge that Miss Mercer has done this family a great service." She looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw warmth in her sharp eyes. A very great service indeed. The Duke hesitated, then nodded slowly. He lowered the deed, though he did not put it away. "Very well," he said. "But this conversation is not finished, Rowena. There are things that must be said, things I should have said long ago." My heart stumbled over itself. What things? But he only shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time that night. "Tomorrow," he said, "when we have all rested, when the sun is up and the world seems less like a fever dream." He paused, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Tomorrow, I will tell you everything." The gentlemen took their leave shortly afterward, each of them pausing to offer me words of congratulation and astonishment. The man with the monocle pressed my hand warmly and declared that he had never witnessed anything so remarkable in all his years of card-playing. The stout fellow with ginger whiskers simply stared at me as though I had sprouted wings and flown about the room. When they were gone, and the great house had settled into the hush of early morning, I found myself alone in the entrance hall. The candles had burned low, casting long shadows across the marble floor, and through the tall windows I could see the first pale fingers of dawn reaching across the sky. I should have gone to bed. I should have returned to my narrow room in the servants' quarters and collapsed into exhausted sleep. But my feet carried me instead to the library, to the window where I had so often seen the Duke standing in solitary contemplation. I stood there now, looking out at the gardens I loved, at the roses that would bloom again in spring, at the ancient oaks that had watched over this land for centuries. The house was quiet around me, but it was not a cold quiet, not an empty one. It was the quiet of a living thing at rest, of a home that had been saved, of a future that had been restored. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and let the tears come at last. I had done it. Against all odds, against all reason, I had done it. But even as relief washed over me, I could not shake the memory of the Duke's words, the promise in his eyes, the questions that remained unanswered. "Tomorrow," he had said. "Tomorrow, I will tell you everything." I did not know what tomorrow would bring. I did not know if the chasm between a maid and a duke could ever truly be crossed. But for the first time in 7 years, I allowed myself to hope. And hope, I had learned, was the most dangerous gamble of all. I slept for only a few hours, but when I woke, the world seemed different. The pale winter sunlight streaming through the narrow window of my room had a quality I had never noticed before. A softness, a warmth, as though the very air had been washed clean by the events of the night. I lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the house stirring to life. The distant clatter of pots in the kitchen, the creak of floorboards overhead, the murmur of voices in the servants' hall. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was the same at all. I rose and dressed with trembling fingers, choosing my cleanest apron and pinning my hair with more care than usual. I did not know what the day would bring, did not know if the Duke's promise of tomorrow had been genuine or merely the exhausted gratitude of a man who had narrowly escaped disaster. But I wanted to be ready. I wanted to face whatever came with my head held high and my heart, however fragile, prepared for any outcome. When I descended to the kitchen, Phoebe was already there, her hands covered in flour, her face flushed from the heat of the ovens. She looked up when I entered, and her expression was unlike anything I had ever seen from her before. It was wonder, pure and unguarded, the look of a woman who has witnessed a miracle. "Rowena," she breathed. She abandoned her pastry dough and crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, pulling me into an embrace that smelled of bread and butter and home. Oh, my dear girl, my brave, impossible girl. I hugged her back, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "You heard what happened? Heard?" She pulled back to look at me, her eyes shining. "The entire household heard. The footmen have been talking of nothing else since dawn. They say you faced down Baron Craven like a queen facing a dragon. They say you exposed him as a cheat in front of half the gentlemen of London. They say the Duke looked at you as though you had hung the moon in the sky." I felt my cheeks flush. That is an exaggeration. Is it? Phoebe studied my face with knowing eyes. "I have lived in this house for 30 years, Rowena. I have watched that boy grow into a man. I have seen him through grief and struggle and the weight of responsibilities that would have crushed a lesser soul. And I have never, not once, seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you last night." My heart stuttered. "Phoebe, I am a maid. He is a duke. Whatever you think you saw, it cannot be what you imagine." She smiled, a slow, secret smile that made her look suddenly younger. "Love does not care about aprons and titles, my dear. Love only cares about hearts." She patted my cheek with her floury hand. "Now go. He has been asking for you since he woke. He is in the morning room, waiting." I stared at her, frozen. "Asking for me?" "Go," she repeated, giving me a gentle push toward the door. "And Rowena, whatever happens, know that you have already proven yourself worthy of anything you might desire, even a duke." The walk from the kitchen to the morning room had never seemed so long. My footsteps echoed on the flagstones, and with each step my heart beat faster and my courage wavered more. I passed through the servants' corridor and into the main hall, past the portraits of Ashworth ancestors who seemed to watch me with silent judgment, past the great staircase where I had stood in the shadows so many nights, past the library where I had allowed myself to dream. The morning room was at the back of the house, a bright and airy space with tall windows that looked out over the rose garden. It was Lady Sophronia's favorite room, and it was here that the family took their breakfast when they were not entertaining guests. I had served countless meals in this room, had poured tea and arranged flowers, and quietly disappeared into the background as the quality of the house went about their lives. But today, when I pushed open the door, there was no background to disappear into. The Duke was alone. He stood at the window, just as I had seen him stand so many times before, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. But when he heard the door, he turned, and the expression on his face made my breath catch in my throat. He looked at me as though I were the sunrise itself. "Rowena," he said, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before, a softness, a vulnerability that stripped away the armor of his title and his pride. "You came. You asked for me, I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too formal, too distant. I did not know how to be anything else. He crossed the room toward me, and with each step, the space between us seemed to shrink in ways that went beyond mere distance. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I could see the shadows beneath his eyes from his sleepless night, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood that always clung to him. I did not sleep, he said quietly. I lay awake for hours, thinking about what happened, thinking about you. He paused, and I saw him struggle to find the right words. Rowena, I have been a fool. Your grace? No. He shook his head, a gesture of frustration. Do not call me that. Not now, not after everything. My name is Cedric. I would like you to use it. I could not speak. The intimacy of what he was asking, the breaking of every rule that governed the world we lived in, left me breathless. He seemed to understand my silence. He took another step closer, and now I could feel the warmth of him, could see the pulse beating at his throat. I have watched you for 7 years, he said. Did you know that? I have watched you move through this house with such quiet grace, such dignity, such care. I have watched you tend to every detail, remember every preference, anticipate every need before it was spoken, and I have told myself again and again that what I felt was merely gratitude, merely appreciation, merely the natural regard of a master for a valued servant. He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I lied to myself, Rowena. I lied because the truth was too terrifying to admit. Because admitting it would mean confronting everything I had been taught about duty and station and the proper order of the world. What truth? I whispered, though I already knew. I had always known, in that secret chamber of my heart, where hope had refused to die. He reached out and took my hand. His fingers were warm, strong, trembling slightly, and the touch sent a shock through my entire body, as though I had been struck by lightning. The truth that I love you, he said, that I have loved you for longer than I can remember, that when I stood in that card room last night and watched you face down Baron Craven with nothing but your wits and your courage and your single-pound sterling, I felt something break open inside me, something that had been locked away for years. Tears spilled down my cheeks. I could not stop them, did not even try. Cedric, I said, and his name on my lips was like a prayer, like a promise, like coming home. I am a maid. I am nothing. I have nothing to offer you but my heart, and even that seems too poor a gift for a man of your station. He lifted his other hand and cupped my face gently, wiping away my tears with his thumb. You are not nothing, he said fiercely. You are everything. You saved my home. You saved my honor. You saw a truth that everyone else missed, and you had the courage to act upon it when the stakes could not have been higher. He paused, and his voice dropped to a whisper. And you loved this house when I was too broken to love it myself. You loved it for both of us, Rowena. How could I not love you in return? I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. The barriers I had built around my heart, the walls I had constructed from years of longing and self-denial, came crumbling down like ancient ruins in an earthquake. I felt exposed, vulnerable, more terrified than I had been facing Baron Craven across the card table. But I also felt, for the first time in my life, truly seen. There will be scandal, I said, opening my eyes to meet his. Society will never accept a match between a duke and a servant. They will say you have lost your mind. They will say, I have bewitched you, manipulated you, trapped you. They will make our lives very difficult. Let them, he said simply. I have spent my entire life trying to meet the expectations of a society that cares more about appearances than truth. I am tired of it, Rowena. I am tired of being alone. I am tired of watching the woman I love serve tea in my own house while pretending that my heart does not ache every time she leaves the room. He pulled me closer, and I went willingly, helplessly, like a ship drawn to harbor after a storm. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of what you did last night, though that would be reason enough. Marry me because I cannot imagine my life without you. Marry me because this house needs a mistress who will love it as you do. Marry me because I am selfish and proud and utterly incapable of letting you go." I laughed through my tears, a sound that was half sob and half joy. "You are asking me to marry you? A maid with a single pound to her name. I am asking the woman who saved everything I hold dear," he said. "I am asking the woman who taught me what courage truly means. I am asking the woman I love." He paused, and his voice softened. "What is your answer, Rowena?" I looked at him, at this man I had loved in silence for 7 years, at the hope and fear warring in his storm-gray eyes. I thought of all the reasons I should refuse, all the obstacles that stood between us, all the voices that would rise in condemnation. And then I thought of my father, who had taught me that sometimes the greatest risk is the only path to the greatest reward. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy, the shadows lifting, the weariness falling away. He pulled me into his arms and held me as though I were the most precious thing in the world, and I buried my face against his chest and wept with a happiness I had never known existed. We stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the morning sunlight streaming around us like a benediction. And when at last we drew apart, I saw Lady Sophronia standing in the doorway, watching us with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Well," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it is about time." Cedric laughed, a real laugh, full and warm and utterly without restraint. "Did you plan this, Aunt Sophronia? Did you know all along?" She walked into the room, her back straight despite her years, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and vindication. "I knew," she said, "that there was something special about Miss Mercer from the moment she arrived. I knew that she watched and listened and understood more than any servant had a right to understand. And I knew," she added, looking at me with a warmth that made my heart swell, "that she loved you. Not your title, not your wealth, not your position. You." She had simply convinced herself that such love was impossible. "It was impossible," I said softly, "by every rule of the world we live in." Lady Sophronia snorted, an elegant sound that managed to convey both amusement and contempt. "Rules are made by people," she said, "and people can change them." She took my hand and pressed it between her own. "Welcome to the family, my dear. You have earned your place here 1,000 times over." The rest of that day passed in a blur of wonder and disbelief. Phoebe wept when she heard the news, great joyful sobs that shook her ample frame. The footmen and housemaids gathered in the servants' hall, uncertain how to address me now that my status had so dramatically changed. The gardener brought me a bouquet of winter roses from the greenhouse, stammering his congratulations. And through it all, Cedric stayed by my side, his hand finding mine whenever we were near each other, as though he could not quite believe I was real. But beneath the joy, a shadow lingered. Baron Craven's threat echoed in my memory, a dark chord in the symphony of my happiness. "This is not over," he had said. "You have made an enemy tonight." I did not speak of it to Cedric. I did not want to dim the light in his eyes or burden him with fears that might prove groundless. But as the sun set over Ashworth Manor and the candles were lit for evening, I stood once more at the library window and gazed out at the gathering darkness. I had won the battle, but something told me the war was far from over, and I was right. The scandal arrived 3 days later, carried on the wings of whispers and the pages of the London gossip sheets. Baron Craven, it seemed, had not retreated quietly to lick his wounds. Instead, he had gone directly to the city and told his version of events to anyone who would listen. The story he spread was a masterpiece of malicious invention. painting me as a scheming adventuress who had seduced the Duke of Ashworth with tricks and feminine wiles, who had orchestrated the entire card game as part of an elaborate plot to elevate herself from servant to mistress of a great house. The letters began arriving on the fourth morning. Some were addressed to Cedric, stern missives from distant relatives and society acquaintances expressing their shock and dismay at his rumored engagement to a common maid. Others were addressed to Lady Sophronia, appeals to her reason and her sense of propriety, begging her to intervene before her great-nephew destroyed the family name forever. A few were addressed to me, anonymous notes filled with vitriol and threats, warning me that I would never be accepted, that I would spend my life as an outcast, that no amount of love could bridge the chasm between my station and the world I presumed to enter. I read them all, sitting alone in the room that had once been my tiny servant's quarters, but which Cedric had insisted I vacate for a proper guest chamber. I read them with steady hands and dry eyes, though each word landed like a blow against my heart. I had known this would happen. I had warned Cedric that society would never accept us. But knowing and experiencing are two very different things, and the cruelty of those letters cut deeper than I had anticipated. It was Lady Sophronia who found me there, surrounded by the evidence of the world's contempt. She did not knock. She simply swept into the room like a force of nature, took one look at the papers scattered across my lap, and made a sound of disgust that conveyed more eloquence than 1,000 words. "Burn them," she said. I looked up at her, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "Burn them." She crossed to the fireplace where a small blaze crackled against the December chill and held out her hand. "Give them to me, and I will do it myself if you lack the resolve. But should I not know what they say? Should I not understand what we are facing?" Lady Sophronia's eyes softened, though her spine remained as straight as a ramrod. "My dear girl," she said, "I have lived for 73 years. I have weathered scandals that would make these petty scribbles look like love letters. I have watched empires rise and fall, watched fortunes made and lost, watched men and women destroy each other over nothing more than wounded pride and jealous hearts. And I have learned one truth that has never failed me." She paused, and her voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "The opinions of small people do not matter. What matters is what you know to be true. What matters is who you are, not who they say you are." She took the letters from my unresisting hands and fed them one by one into the flames. I watched them curl and blacken and turn to ash, and with each one that burned, I felt something lighten inside me. "Now," Lady Sophronia said, brushing her hands together with satisfaction, "get dressed. We have a wedding to plan. And I will not have you moping in your room while Baron Craven poisons every drawing room in London with his lies." She was right, of course. She was always right. And so I rose from my chair, washed my face, and went downstairs to face whatever the world chose to throw at me. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and defiance. Lady Sophronia proved herself a general of remarkable strategic ability, marshalling her forces with precision and purpose. She wrote letters of her own, reaching out to old friends and former allies, women of influence who remembered her from her youth and owed her favors accumulated over decades of careful social navigation. She invited them to Ashworth Manor for tea, for luncheon, for intimate dinners where they could meet the remarkable young woman who had saved the estate from a known cheat and scoundrel. The tide began to turn. It turned slowly at first, a trickle of curious visitors who came expecting to find a scheming fortune hunter and left charmed by my quiet dignity and obvious devotion to both the Duke and his ancestral home. Then the trickle became a stream, as word spread that the infamous Miss Mercer was not at all what the gossips had claimed. She was educated, they whispered. She was well-spoken. She had manners that would put half the debutantes of the season to shame. And the way the Duke looked at her, well, even the most hardened cynic could not deny that what existed between them was genuine. Baron Craven's version of events began to unravel. The gentleman who had witnessed the card game spoke up, confirming that it was the Baron who had been caught cheating, not the maid who had exposed him. His reputation, already tarnished by his humiliating defeat, crumbled further under the weight of their testimony. By the time Christmas arrived, he had become a pariah, shunned by the very society he had tried to manipulate, his name a byword for dishonor and disgrace. I took no pleasure in his downfall. I had never wished him ill, only wished to protect what I loved. But I would be lying if I said I did not feel a certain grim satisfaction when I heard that he had sold Thornfield Hall and departed for the continent, seeking to escape the ruins of his reputation in the anonymity of foreign shores. The wedding was held on the first day of February in the small stone chapel that stood at the edge of the Ashworth estate. It was not a grand affair, not the lavish spectacle that society would have expected for the marriage of a duke. But it was perfect. The pews were filled with those who truly mattered, Phoebe and the household staff, Lady Sophronia resplendent in silver silk, a handful of friends and neighbors who had proven their loyalty through the trials of the preceding months. I wore a gown of ivory satin, simple and elegant, with a veil of antique lace that Lady Sophronia had worn at her own first wedding half a century before. Phoebe had woven winter roses into my hair, the same roses that climbed the eastern wall of the manor, and as I walked down the aisle toward the man I loved, I felt as though I were floating, as though my feet had left the ground and I was being carried on wings of pure joy. Cedric waited at the altar, his storm-gray eyes bright with unshed tears. He had never looked more handsome, more noble, more utterly and completely mine. When I reached him and placed my hand in his, I felt the tremor that ran through his fingers, felt the depth of emotion he was struggling to contain. "You came," he whispered, echoing the words he had spoken that morning in the sunlit room when everything changed. I smiled through my own tears. "I will always come," I said. "Wherever you are, whatever happens, I will always find my way back to you." The vicar spoke the ancient words, and we made our vows before God and the small assembly of witnesses. When Cedric slipped the ring onto my finger, a simple band of gold that had belonged to his mother, I felt the weight of it, like a promise, like an anchor, like the seal on a contract that bound us together for all eternity. And when he kissed me, there in the flickering candlelight of the chapel with the winter wind howling outside, I knew that I had finally found the place I was always meant to be. The reception was held in the great hall of Ashworth Manor, beneath the portraits of generations of Ashworths who gazed down upon the celebration with painted eyes. Phoebe had outdone herself, preparing a feast that would have graced the table of any nobleman in England. There was music and laughter and dancing, and at some point in the evening, Lady Sophronia stood and raised her glass for a toast. "To the new Duchess of Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Who came to us as a servant and leaves us as a daughter. Who taught us that courage comes in many forms, and that love recognizes no boundaries of class or station." She turned to look at me, and I saw in her eyes a pride that brought fresh tears to my own. May she grace these halls for many years to come. May she fill them with joy and laughter and all the blessings that this house has been too long without. And may she always remember that she won her place here, not through luck or chance, but through the strength of her own remarkable heart. The guests raised their glasses, and I found myself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the love that surrounded me. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the guests had departed, Cedric and I walked together through the quiet halls of our home. The candles had burned low, casting soft shadows on the walls, and through the tall windows we could see the stars scattered across the winter sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Are you happy?" Cedric asked, his arm warm around my waist. I leaned into him, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid reality of his presence. "I am more than happy," I said. "I am home." He stopped walking and turned to face me. In the dim light, his features were softer, younger, the lines of worry and grief that had marked him for so long finally beginning to fade. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a worn deck of cards, the edges soft, the faces faded with age and use. My breath caught. "Where did you get these?" "Lady Sophronia," he said. "She told me the story of your father, of the Pennington emeralds, of the man who won a fortune and gave it back because a lady's tears were not worth the price. She tracked down his effects after he died and kept these, waiting for the right moment to return them." I took the cards with trembling hands. They were my father's, the very deck he had used to teach me everything I knew. I had thought them lost forever, sold with everything else we owned to pay for his burial. But here they were, worn and familiar, carrying the ghost of his touch in every crease and fold. "She wanted you to have them on your wedding day," Cedric continued. "She said that your father would have been proud, that he would have recognized in you the same spirit that made him who he was, the gambler who played not for greed, but for love, who understood that the greatest stakes are always matters of the heart." I clutched the cards to my chest, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for this. Thank you for everything." He gathered me into his arms and held me close. "No," he said softly. "Thank you, Rowena. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible in my own despair. Thank you for believing in this house when I had lost faith. Thank you for taking the greatest gamble of all and betting on us." We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the old house settling around us like a grandmother drawing a blanket over sleeping children. And in that moment, I understood something that my father had tried to teach me all those years ago, something I had only just begun to grasp. "Life is a game of cards," he had said. "You cannot control what you are dealt, but you can control how you play your hand. The secret is not in the cards themselves, but in the courage to stay at the table, to keep playing, even when the odds seem impossible, to believe that fortune favors the bold." I had been dealt a hand of poverty and loss, of servitude and invisible longing. But I had played it with everything I had, and I had won. Not just a house, not just a title, not just the love of a man who saw past my apron to the woman beneath. I had won myself. I had won the right to be seen, to be valued, to take my place in the world without shame or apology. I had won the knowledge that I was worthy, not because of what I possessed, but because of who I was. And that, I thought as I looked up at my husband, at the man who had chosen me against all convention and expectation, was the greatest prize of all. The years that followed were kinder than I had dared to hope. Society, fickle as always, eventually forgot the scandal of the Duke who married his maid and moved on to fresher gossip. Lady Sophronia lived for another decade, sharp-tongued and sharp-eyed to the very end, and when she finally passed, it was peacefully, in her chair by the fire, with a satisfied smile on her face. Phoebe remained in the kitchen until her own retirement, training a succession of assistants who never quite matched her talent but tried their best to honor her legacy. And Cedric and I, we grew old together in the house we both loved. We walked the gardens in spring and sat by the fire in winter. We watched the roses climb the eastern wall year after year, their pink blooms a defiant declaration against the gray English sky. We loved each other fiercely, tenderly, with a devotion that only deepened as the seasons turned. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I would take out my father's deck of cards and shuffle them absently, feeling the familiar whisper of paper against paper. And I would remember the night when everything changed, when a maid with nothing but a single £1 and a lifetime of watching sat down at a table of gentlemen and bet everything on the impossible. I learned to read a man's soul by the way he held his cards, I would think. And I learned to love a man I was never meant to touch. Both lessons came from the same house, the same silence, the same impossible distance between a servant's apron and a duke's signet ring. But the distance, I had discovered, was never as far as it seemed. It only required the courage to cross it. And that courage in the end was worth more than all the manors and all the fortunes in the world.